welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Damien.
And I'm Aaron. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week, we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Aaron, you're up this week. Mm-hmm. What are you bringing to the table today?
Yeah, I am bringing Demon Mineral, which is a documentary about the impact of uranium mining on Navajo land, and that mining has not been remediated.
Yeah.
It's about the health impacts of this mining on Navajo people and the environmental impacts on the land. And I thought this was a really brilliant film. It moves at a very deliberative pace. There's a lot of quiet moments throughout, and it makes you feel like the film is forcing you to sit with the facts of the mining and the impact that it has and continues to have. And then a few of those quiet moments are juxtaposed with loud music, which is interesting.
Yes.
There's a Navajo metal band called Testify, I believe, that is featured, and then a brother and sister duo who seem to be mixing a kind of indie rock with some more traditional musical traditions, I suppose, that are maybe Navajo-based.
Right.
And there are scientists and community organizers also featured throughout the film. They do some testifying to Congress and other bodies, and it's, I think, really well done. And I learned quite a bit from it about history that I didn't know, such as the Church Rock spill, which is one of, if not the worst nuclear disaster in U.S. history, which happened just a few months after 3 Mile Island, which I feel like we all have heard about, and this didn't receive near as much coverage. And yeah, that spill was a result of the mining and a failure of a dam for a pond that they had that was part of the process. And so just really terrible history that I didn't know, and I appreciate this film teaching me that. But what about you? Where do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. This film was brilliant on so many levels. I mean, it was illuminating and captivating and certainly educational. Yeah. And I also learned so much from this film. And I really agree with you about the use of juxtaposition in this documentary. This film kind of took me back to my former and very brief life as a digital designer. And I sort of nerded out a little bit while watching it. I was compelled right out of the gate with the opening scenes of the film. It was this panning of the land in black and white that simultaneously juxtaposed this stillness of life with the sound of the wind howling, which I thought was just really beautiful, and it drew me right in. Because you're right, a lot of the moments of the film that were like that were very slow moving. And so you had to just sort of sit with that. And then there are these other moments where you're bombarded with this loud rock music. And I think all of that was a really intentional choice by the director and the producers of this film. And, as you said, there were so many moments where I felt like I had to I was forced to sit with what I had just learned, whether that be this awful history or the health and scientific impacts, the uranium mining that was happening and the radioactivity in the area, or the personal stories of the Diné people and the Navajo people and how their lives have been impacted and continue to be impacted by this uranium mining and incidents like Church Rock spill, which I absolutely want to talk about. And so to me, this film is a must watch if you haven't seen it. I had not heard about it until you introduced it to us. It was so powerful, and I'm really glad we watched it. And there's a lot that I learned from it, and I felt there were a lot of moments where I was sitting and thinking, like, there's so much in the way to connect this film to everything that we learn and unlearn in the podcast and we talk about here in the podcast. And so again, I feel very grateful that we got to watch this. And like you said, I learned so much from it too.
Yeah, and it's relatively recent. I think it came out last year.
Yes.
And so, it's really great. And, support your local library and stream it on Canopy.
Yes.
So one of the concepts that was shared in the film was shared by Leona Morgan, who's a co-founder of the Nuclear Issues Study Group. So she shared this concept called nuclear colonialism.
Yes.
Which is about how a lot of this kind of mining happens on indigenous land around the world. And then there are poor worker conditions, including low pay, and a lack of education on the health risks to the community and to the workers.
Yes.
And she says, quote, "This is what nuclear colonialism is. All of this is taking land, contaminating our water, desecrating our sacred sites, and damaging our genetic future." Which is such a powerful, all-encompassing kind of definition.
Yes.
And it's such a clear example of the necropolitical choices of the U.S. government and governments around the world that choose to do these things.
Yes.
And the government has decided at some point that uranium is really important and started mining it without any regard for the workers or for the Navajo people who live there. And there was no safety equipment for the miners. We hear from a firsthand account of seeing people mine. And so this is a decision about mining uranium despite the costs to people.
Yes.
There's no consideration for what it actually costs outside of the monetary value, which I'm sure was a consideration. But like, what's the health impact?
Yep.
What's the environmental impact? No concern about that because we need the uranium for whatever reason in that moment.
Yeah. The no concern there, the without any regard piece it's key to me there. And I love that you harken back to necropolitics there. But yeah, there was definitely no regard for the safety of the miners, certainly no regard for the indigenous people who live there and consider that land sacred and truly live off of that land in the grandest sense of that term. And so that concept of nuclear colonialism was definitely a huge takeaway from this film. And so related to that, you brought up the Church Rock spill, and I wanted to talk about that because, as you said, I hadn't heard of it, right? Yep. And, so this happened back in the summer of 1979, and as you mentioned, it was one of the worst nuclear disasters in U.S. history. And so the brief synopsis of the story is that there was this unlined uranium disposal pond, which was maintained by a company called the United Nuclear Corporation. And basically it cracked and it flooded the area with radioactive water. And that spill to this day is the largest release of radioactive material ever that has ever taken place in this country. And, one of the things that stopped me in this film is they make a point, and this is one of those brilliant moments in the film where it kind of gets quiet and you have to sort of sit with it. But they compare this to the 3 Mile Island accident, which had taken place just a few months earlier. But as soon as they mentioned that, I thought to myself, like, oh, I know about 3 Mile Island, but I don't know this one. And that's the point that this film is trying to make, why is that? Right? And I think when you think about it and compare the fact that the Church Rock spill took place in New Mexico on indigenous land, whereas the 3 Mile Island accident took place in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, I think the answer to that becomes pretty clear pretty quickly, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's part of it is who's involved, and then the ruralness of Church Rock is also there. And so there's a point I either read somewhere or heard in the film, I don't remember which, that there wasn't the same media attention, like there's not the same media outlets there. And all of that is also connected. All of that.
Yes, that's a very good point. So, yeah, absolutely.
But there's these big impacts on people. And so we learn in the film there's a point where they talk to the Nez family about their experiences. And they're described as an unwitting, long-term, multi-generational study on the effects of prolonged exposure to uranium and radioactive material. Christopher Nez describes watching his siblings die when he was young, and no one knew why. And then he speaks with his mother, Helen, about what the mining was like and what she knew. Yep. And she said she didn't know anything about it. It just started.
Yes.
And then the mining companies started renting their horses and donkeys for the mining process because the Nezes made a living through their livestock. And fast forward several years from that moment with the donkeys and learning about the mining, and she visits a doctor who asks her where she lives, and she explains where she lives, and he says, this is what the problem is. This is why you have health issues and why you've lost children and why some have gotten sick.
Yes.
And some have recovered and some haven't. This mining affects everything.
Yes.
It has no mercy at all. And from there, she's been fighting to get the land designated a Superfund site and get it cleaned up. But this is an example of the impact.
Yes.
And the way that people become disposable to these bigger systems, to the need for this uranium, which if you leave it in the ground is relatively innocuous,
right?
I think, but digging it up creates all of these additional concerns and issues. And they talk about how there are radon vents in the ground, which were a so-called safety precaution for the miners so that they weren't exposed to as much radon, and radon was vented out of the mines and stuff. But those vents are still there, and then therefore people who are on the land are exposed to the radon from the vents. And those aren't marked. And so it's just we learned so much through, I think, this one story about this one family, about how much of an impact it has had and what kind of impact it has been and will continue to be.
Absolutely.
Even beyond it being cleaned up, it'll continue to have an impact. There's been this sort of generational impact
of this uranium mining. And one of the other things the film does that's related to this, you mentioned their livestock, right? And the film does a great job in talking about how the Diné women, right, they're immersed in livestock farming and taking care of livestock, and even the animals are impacted, right? Like every bit of the land, every creature on the land has had a health impact by this uranium, right?
Yeah, there's a moment where there's some animal that appears that is not domesticated, I think. And I forget who was speaking. Somebody's speaking. It's like that animal has tumors all over it.
All over it.
And you can't, like, we couldn't see it necessarily in the film, but they could see it in person. And so that it's a reality for all of that.
Yes, and everyone there. And their story was so heartbreaking, right? I can't imagine the literal hell that they've been through, and to watch, to watch children die, to watch other children be sick, to not know what's going on, for that just to start happening and continue to happen. I mean, that's just unfathomable, really. And to have it all be a result of this uranium mining is just really evil, in my opinion. And this reminds me, going back to this idea of the use of juxtapositions in this film, one of the other things that stood out to me was comparing the literal hell that the Navajo people were experiencing with how Hollywood has used their land to tell what they refer to as whitewash stories about the land and life on the land. And, we've talked about this before in different contexts, but the media and pop culture's role in telling stories, I think, has a huge impact on the widespread knowledge of people's lived experiences. Like what we see on the screen is oftentimes what people take, and what am I searching for? The word I'm searching for here, like that's what you remember. That's what you learn, right? When you see it,
it becomes part of the mythology. It becomes,
yes, thank you.
You get it's part of your socialization. You accept it as being, if not the truth, a truth, or connected to a truth.
Absolutely, right? And so, those are the stories that get told, and that's what gets seated in people's mind and their understanding. And these stories are often in direct conflict to the true lived experiences of people, especially marginalized people, and in this context, especially the Navajo people. And so that was certainly the case here. And the focus of these films was often on cowboys and the action and the sensationalized story plots, and not on the settler colonialism and the nuclear colonialism, as you mentioned, and the environmental racism that was at play here, and just had this tremendously harmful impact on Indigenous people and Indigenous communities. And so, all that to say, I just appreciated the film naming that piece, because I wasn't expecting it, but it was another part that made me sort of sit and think about, they were clearing that land, and here come the movie cameras, and we're filming here, and it's like, what? Let's clean this up. Let's help these people instead of making money off of the land in this way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's not how it works.
No, of course not. And that's why we're here.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's talk about application.
Okay.
How does this film apply to our day-to-day lives and work for collective liberation? And I think this is another clear example. The stories are another clear example of settler colonialism.
Yes.
It's the extraction of uranium, no matter the costs, which is a theme of the United States throughout our history.
Yes.
There's a lot of moments we can point to and say, we must do X, Y, Z, no matter the costs. But those costs are always connected to human beings, like the Navajo. The interests of the government and private industry above all else is how we do things. And the Navajo and most regular people are forced into service of those interests.
Yeah.
And this is another one of those stories.
Absolutely.
Where not only are Navajo people impacted, but the people who were brought in to mine it, whether they were Navajo or not, are also impacted. That's a part of the story too, is the way that people become disposable.
Yes.
And the way that people get used in the service of the interests of government or private industry or what have you. And this is another story that reflects that.
Absolutely. There's just the grave impact of settler colonialism. I absolutely will co-sign that application. I'm not surprised by it, right?
Yeah.
But it always boggles my mind and disappoints me so to see how the United States has always chosen profit over people and has chosen commodity over humanity and has chosen and sided with corporations over human life. And time again, we see that example. We see that the United States has chosen the settler colonialist project, as you mentioned, and it displaces and it harms and it disposes and it erases, in this case, Indigenous life. And that to me is just so heartbreaking. And this particular manifestation of that settler colonialism, of uranium mining, and the ways in which that has devastated the Navajo and the Diné people, to me, is just wild and just unconscionable. So, I'm grateful that documentaries like this one exist. And I'm hopeful that it supports the incredible activism that we got to see in this film and, that folks are doing to, as you said, get the area designated as a Superfund site, get it cleaned up, hopefully take care of folks, fight for reparations. We know that that's happening too, and just other forms of justice for the people who live and are impacted by this. I think art has a way of supporting those efforts. Yeah. And so, and on top of just being incredibly illuminating and educational, as I mentioned. And so, I'm again grateful that we got to watch this film.
Yeah, me too. I'm glad I found it.
Yes.
It's happenstance,
Yeah.
All right. Well, great application all around. It's homework time.
Hey.
What are we going to do to continue our learning and unlearning beyond our conversation today? My homework is to learn more about some of the initiatives that Deb Haaland implemented while she has been Secretary of the Interior.
She's in this film.
She is. She's a member of the Laguno Pueblo tribe and is the first Indigenous cabinet secretary in the history of the U.S., and she was interviewed toward the end of this documentary.
Right.
While she was still serving in Congress for New Mexico's 1st District, she has implemented a new unit in the Bureau of Indian Affairs that is focused on missing and murdered Indigenous women. And she has also earmarked $25 million for bison conservation and a few other things too. So I just want to learn a little bit more about some of the things that she's done.
Yeah.
Because I feel like the Department of Interior in general flies under the radar as a entity. And I feel like her work has flown under the radar in terms of the stories of this particular administration.
Yes.
So I'm interested to know more about what it is she was able to accomplish in that position, and just sort of know more about that.
Yeah, and hopefully what good came out of that work, or hopefully continues to come out of that work. I would love to learn more about that too. And you're right, the Department of the Interior. I mean, with the administration being what it is and all that is happening in our day-to-day politics, I feel like it can get lost.
Yes.
But there's some great work happening there, so that would be great to learn from. I would also just love to do more of a deep dive into and learn more about the Church Rock uranium spill and just broaden my learning about that even more. And I also would really love to see and learn more about the activism and organizing that's happening and the fight for justice there, and just see what ways we can amplify what's happening and some of the work that's being done that we learned about in this film, and, see what ways we can, again, amplify and support that, because, yeah, it needs it.
It does.
Yeah.
There's so much to reckon with, and for there to be reparations made and cleanup and all of that.
Yeah, please clean it up. Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's it for this week. And Damien, you're up next time.
Yes,
What are
sir.
you bringing to the table in our next episode?
Oh boy, I am so excited to be bringing our first book of 2025 to the table for us for our next episode. For anyone new to our podcast, I met someone last night and introduced them to our podcast. They were like, I want to check it out. And I was like, yes. So for anyone new to our podcast, we have this tradition, if you will, of reading one book a month, at least one book a month, which has certainly been a highlight of our podcast for me. And so the book I've chosen is an exciting one because it is truly hot off the presses. It was literally just published this month by our friends over at Haymarket Books. So it's, again, very new, but also right on time. The book is called Teach Truth, The Struggle for Anti-Racist Education. And it was written by Jesse Hagopian. And so here's how Haymarket describes the book on their website, or part of the description I pulled. Quote, in just the last few years, scores of states have introduced or passed legislation that would require teachers to lie to students about structural racism and other forms of oppression. Books have been cut from curricula and pulled from school library shelves. Teachers have been fired and threatened with discipline. As longtime organizer, writer, and high school teacher Jesse Hagopian argues in Teach Truth, at stake is our democracy, not to mention the annihilation of entire systems of knowledge that challenge the status quo. As Hagopian shows by exploring the origins, philosophy, and manifestations of these attacks, the right's effort to regulate knowledge is an attempt to maintain its power over the American capitalist system now and into the future. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm almost done this book, and it has been so great. There are so many examples that Jesse offers us about what is taking place literally across the country, in states all across the country. Maryland's in there. I mean, I feel like almost every state is in there. And so there are a lot of case studies and a lot of analysis about those case studies that has been so illuminating and so wonderful to learn from. Obviously not wonderful in all of the ways, but there's a lot of just brilliant analysis in this book. And I think as educators, maybe I'll speak for myself. I'm sure it does to you. As educators, this really speaks to me. And so I'm really excited about this one and looking forward to chatting about it with you.
Yeah, me too. I'm excited that we were able to get a copy of this.
Yes.
From Haymarket. So thanks for that. And yeah, it's been what I've read so far has been really great. And I feel like Jesse is creating language related to this that I appreciate.
Yes.
In terms of uncritical race theorists and educational arsonists and a few other things that I can't remember right now, but are throughout the book that I appreciate that kind of, this is what I'm going to call these people, or this is what I'm going to call this action. And I think that's it's helpful. It feels empowering.
Yeah.
It feels like a way to name the thing that's happening in a real way.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, it should be a good conversation. I'm looking forward to it.
Yes, me too. But with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on social media, including Instagram and TikTok while you still can.
Oh, boy.
Check us out on YouTube and sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. And we'll talk to you next week.